Imagine asking an artificial intelligence one question that has divided humanity for thousands of years. Does God exist? Not what is the weather? Not who invented the internet? Not even what will happen to humanity when AI becomes more powerful? Or a much bigger question. Now imagine that the AI answering that question is Grok, the chatbot created by Elon Musk's XAI. Grok has become known for answering provocative questions that many other systems might approach more cautiously. But when you ask an artificial intelligence whether God exists, something strange happens. The machine is suddenly standing at the intersection of science, philosophy, religion, mathematics, consciousness, and human history. And there is no simple database entry that says God yes or God no. There are arguments, counter-arguments, religious revelations, philosophical systems, scientific observations, personal experiences, and billions of people who are absolutely convinced that they know the answer. So what happens when Grok is asked to decide? The first thing we need to understand is that this is not simply a question about religion. It is a question about what counts as evidence. If someone says, I believe God exists because I experienced something spiritual, that is evidence to the person who experienced it. But another person cannot necessarily reproduce that experience in a laboratory. If someone says, the universe exists, therefore God must have created it, that is a philosophical argument. But another philosopher can challenge the assumptions behind it. If someone says, science has not proven God exists, that does not automatically prove God does not exist. And if someone says, science cannot disprove God, that does not automatically prove God does exist. That middle ground is where this entire conversation becomes fascinating. Because Grok is being asked to navigate a question that human beings have been unable to settle even after thousands of years of debate. And perhaps the most unexpected part is that Elon Musk himself has publicly engaged with questions about God and meaning. Musk has described God in terms of a creator and has discussed the idea that the universe must have come from something, while also questioning the labels humans use to describe that ultimate reality. That makes the subject even more interesting, because Grok was created by a person who has openly discussed some of these questions, but Grok does not approach the question of God as a human believer would. It does not pray. It does not worship. It does not have a childhood. It does not have a spiritual experience. It does not fear death. It does not possess a personal soul that we can verify. It is an artificial intelligence processing information. So if Grok says God exists, that does not mean the machine has personally encountered God. And if it says there's no evidence that God exists, that does not mean it has proven that God does not exist. It means the system is constructing an answer from the information, reasoning patterns, instructions, and context available to it. That distinction may sound small, but it is actually everything. Because people have a natural tendency to treat confident language as evidence. If a human being says, I think God exists, you understand that this is a belief. But when an AI gives a carefully written paragraph filled with logical arguments, scientific terminology, historical references, and philosophical concepts, it can sound much more authoritative. And that creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion that the machine has somehow looked beyond the universe and checked. It hasn't. No AI has been outside reality looking back at existence. No AI has entered heaven. No AI has stood before God. No AI has scientifically observed the absence of God. And yet people keep asking. Why? Because perhaps we are not really asking the machine to prove God. Perhaps we are asking it to organize the strongest arguments humanity has ever created. And when you look at those arguments, the conversation becomes much deeper. One of the oldest arguments for God begins with existence itself. Why is there something rather than nothing? Look around you. Galaxies, stars, planets, atoms, life, consciousness. The universe exists. But why? If everything that begins to exist requires an explanation, some philosophers argue that the universe itself requires an explanation beyond the universe. This idea appears in different forms throughout the history of philosophy, including cosmological arguments associated with thinkers such as Aristotle, Avicenna, and Thomas Aquinas. The modern version often focuses on the beginning of the universe. If the universe had a beginning, what caused that beginning? And if space and time themselves began with the universe, then the proposed cause could not simply be another ordinary object located somewhere inside space. This is where believers may say the answer is God, but skeptics immediately ask another question. If everything needs a cause, then who caused God? The response from classical theism is that God is not supposed to be an ordinary caused object. God is described as necessary, eternal, or uncaused. And then the debate moves to the definition of God itself. This is what makes the argument so difficult. People sometimes imagine the question as if it were, did a magical person create the universe? But serious philosophical theology is asking a much more sophisticated question. Why does contingent reality exist at all? Why is there something rather than nothing? Does existence ultimately require a necessary foundation? Could the universe itself be that foundation? Could reality be eternal? Could there be something beyond our current understanding? Those are very different possibilities. And this is where an AI like Grok can become useful, not because it knows the answer, but because it can present multiple sides of the argument. Then there's another famous argument, the apparent order of the universe. Look at the laws of physics. The constants governing reality fall within ranges that allow stars, galaxies, chemistry, planets, and eventually life to exist. Some people see this as evidence of design. They argue that the universe appears remarkably structured for life. Others reject that conclusion. They point to the anthropic principle. We can only observe a universe compatible with observers, because if the universe were incompatible with observers, nobody would be here to observe it. Some scientists and philosophers also discuss the possibility of a multiverse where many universes could exist with different physical parameters, and observers would naturally find themselves in one compatible with life. But then another question appears: where did the multiverse come from? And suddenly we are back where we started. Why is there something rather than nothing? This is the strange loop at the center of the God question. Every proposed explanation seems to generate another question, and perhaps that is why humanity has never settled the debate. Then comes consciousness. This may be one of the most fascinating parts of the entire discussion. You are watching this video. You can see the screen, you can hear sounds, you have memories, you have emotions, you have an internal experience of being you. Science can examine the brain. Scientists can measure electrical signals. They can observe how certain brain regions correlate with particular experiences. They can study how injury, disease, drugs, sleep, and anesthesia affect consciousness. But there is still a deep philosophical question. Why does subjective experience exist at all? Why isn't the universe simply a collection of physical processes occurring without anyone experiencing them? Why does a brain produce the feeling of being a person? Some philosophers argue that consciousness can eventually be explained entirely through physical processes. Others believe the problem is much harder. Some religious thinkers argue that consciousness may point towards something beyond matter. But again, none of this constitutes simple proof of God. It creates questions. And questions are exactly what make the debate survive. Then there is morality. Why do human beings experience certain actions as right or wrong? Why do people across cultures develop concepts of justice, fairness, compassion, betrayal, and cruelty? A traditional argument says objective moral values require a transcendent foundation. If there is no God, the argument goes, morality might ultimately be a product of evolution, culture, social cooperation, or individual preference. But critics respond that moral behavior can emerge from social relationships, empathy, rational cooperation, and evolutionary pressures without requiring divine command. And then another problem appears. If something is good only because God commands it, does that make goodness arbitrary? Or does God command it because it is already good? This is known as the Euthyphro problem, and philosophers have debated versions of it for centuries. Again, the question seems simple, but underneath it is an enormous philosophical structure. And this is why asking an AI, does God exist, is not really asking one question. It is asking hundreds of questions at once. What caused the universe? Why does anything exist? What is consciousness? And where does morality come from? Is there objective truth? Can reason establish metaphysical reality? Are religious experiences reliable? Can miracles occur? What does science actually prove, and what are the limits of scientific knowledge? And perhaps the biggest question of all is, what would count as evidence? Now imagine giving all of those questions to an AI. What would happen? The answer might surprise you because the AI could potentially argue both sides. It could produce a powerful case for the existence of God. Then, with a different prompt, it could produce a powerful case against belief in God. That does not necessarily mean the AI is lying. It means it is capable of representing competing arguments. And that brings us to one of the most important lessons about Grok. An AI is not a religious authority. Researchers have already found that large language models can display systematic asymmetries when answering questions about religion and religious conversion. This does not prove that Grok has a hidden religious belief. It proves something much more practical. AI responses can contain patterns. They can reflect training data. They can respond differently to different wording. They can be influenced by context. And they can sound objective even when the underlying answer involves uncertainty. So if Grok says something shocking about God, the right question is not simply, did the AI say it? The better question is, why did the AI say it? What assumptions did it use? What sources support the argument? What alternative explanation exists? Would another AI produce the same answer? Would the answer change if the question were written differently? These questions turn AI from an oracle into a tool for investigation. And that is far more interesting. Because perhaps the real story isn't whether Grok believes in God. Perhaps the real story is what happens when humanity asks a machine to summarize humanity's oldest argument. There's another possibility that makes the question even more uncomfortable. What if God exists, but science cannot detect God in the way it detects physical objects? This is where definitions matter. Science is extraordinarily powerful at investigating measurable phenomena. It can study particles, it can measure radiation, it can observe galaxies, it can test biological mechanisms. But if someone defines God as a transcendent reality outside the physical universe, then asking science to detect God like a particle may be asking the wrong kind of question. That does not prove God exists. It simply means the debate moves partly into philosophy and metaphysics. On the other hand, religious claims that make specific statements about the physical world can sometimes be examined scientifically. And that creates an important boundary. Some questions are empirical, some are philosophical, some are theological, some are personal. And confusing those categories can produce terrible arguments. Now let's consider the opposite possibility. What if God does not exist? What would that mean? For some people, it would mean the universe has no supernatural purpose. Consciousness would emerge from physical processes. Morality would need to be explained through human beings and societies. Life would be temporary. Death would be final. But even then, meaning would not necessarily disappear. A person could argue that meaning is something humans create through relationships, love, knowledge, creativity, and responsibility. You don't necessarily need an eternal universe for human life to matter. A song can be meaningful even though it ends. A conversation can matter even though it lasts only minutes. A friendship can transform someone even though every human life eventually ends. So even the atheist position is not simply nothing matters. It can instead become, because life is limited, what we do with it matters even more. And then we arrive at perhaps the most emotionally powerful part of the entire discussion. If God exists, what does that mean for us? And if God doesn't exist, what does that mean for us? Either answer changes the way we understand our lives. If God exists, then perhaps reality has an ultimate foundation beyond humanity. If God does not exist, then perhaps humans are responsible for creating meaning in a universe that does not provide it automatically. Either way, the question forces us to think about purpose. Why are we here? What should we do? How should we treat other people? What happens when we die? And is there something beyond us? This is why religion has survived despite the rise of modern science. Science can explain extraordinary amounts about how the universe works, but how and why are not always the same question. Science can explain how stars form, but someone can still ask why there is a universe capable of producing stars. Science can explain biological evolution, but someone can still ask why there's a reality in which life and consciousness can emerge. Science can describe brain activity, but someone can still ask why subjective experience exists. And philosophy can ask those questions, even when laboratory experiments cannot directly answer them. This is where the debate becomes almost impossible to finish, because every answer opens another door. And perhaps that's why people are fascinated by an AI answering the question. An AI appears to stand outside human emotion. It doesn't belong to a church. It doesn't attend a mosque. It doesn't meditate in a temple. It doesn't grow up in a religious family. It doesn't experience childhood. It doesn't inherit faith from parents. It can theoretically compare thousands of perspectives without personally belonging to any of them. That makes its answer feel neutral. But neutral looking does not automatically mean neutral. AI systems are built by people. They are trained on human-created information. They operate under human-designed objectives and constraints. And their responses depend on the way questions are asked. So even when an AI sounds detached, it is still operating within a human information ecosystem. This becomes even more important when AI is treated as a spiritual authority. People are increasingly turning to AI systems for questions about meaning, belief, purpose, and even salvation. Think about how strange that is. For most of human history, people looked to prophets, priests, philosophers, scriptures, traditions, and spiritual teachers for answers to ultimate questions. Now some people are asking chatbots, and the chatbot responds instantly. No waiting, no years of study. Just type a question, does God exist? And within seconds, a machine can generate an essay. That convenience is extraordinary. But it also creates a new responsibility. We have to remember that a fluent answer is not the same as ultimate truth. If Grok gives an answer about God, the most interesting thing may be the reasoning behind it. Maybe it points toward cosmology. Maybe it discusses consciousness. Maybe it compares religious arguments. Maybe it says the evidence is inconclusive. Maybe it argues that belief is rational. Maybe it argues that disbelief is rational. But none of those statements should end the conversation. They should begin it. Because the God question is too important to outsource completely to an algorithm. And perhaps that's the unexpected conclusion. The AI may not be able to tell us whether God exists, but it can force us to confront why we believe what we believe. A believer may discover that some of their arguments are stronger than they thought, or weaker. An atheist may discover that some philosophical arguments for God are more sophisticated than the stereotypes they have encountered, or they may discover stronger reasons for remaining unconvinced. An agnostic may realize that uncertainty is not intellectual weakness. It can be a position based on the limits of available evidence, and that is where the conversation becomes genuinely valuable. Because perhaps the most intelligent response to the question, does God exist, is not immediate certainty. Perhaps it is intellectual humility. There are things we know, there are things we strongly believe, there are things we suspect, and there are things we simply do not know. The danger begins when we confuse those categories, and that applies to humans and AI alike. So when you hear that Elon Musk's Grok was asked whether God exists and gave an unexpected answer, don't stop at the shocking sentence. Look deeper. Ask what definition of God the AI is using. Ask what evidence it considers. Ask whether the argument is scientific, philosophical, or theological. Ask what the strongest counterargument is. Ask whether the conclusion logically follows from the evidence. And then ask yourself the question that no AI can answer for you. What do you believe, and why? Because ultimately, the question of God's existence isn't just an AI experiment. It isn't just a viral screenshot. It isn't just a debate between Christians and atheists. It is one of the oldest questions human beings have ever asked. Every civilization has confronted it in some form. Every generation has asked it again. And now our machines are joining the conversation. Humanity created AI to help us understand the universe. Then we turned the machine toward the deepest mystery within that universe, God. And perhaps the strangest part is that the more powerful AI becomes, the more clearly it may reveal something about us. We don't just want information. We want meaning. We don't just want predictions. We want purpose. We don't just want to know how the universe works. We want to know why we are here. And maybe that is why the question refuses to disappear. Because even after thousands of years, billions of prayers, centuries of philosophy, revolutions in science, and the arrival of artificial intelligence, humanity is still looking upward and asking the same question. Is there something beyond us? Grok can analyze the arguments. It can compare the evidence. It can summarize the world's religions. It can challenge assumptions. It can generate 1,000 different explanations. But it cannot make the ultimate decision for you. And perhaps it shouldn't. Because if there is a God, that reality would not become true because an AI approved it. And if there is no God, that reality would not become false because an AI denied it. The truth exists independently of what a machine says, and that may be the most unexpected answer of all. The machine is not the final judge. The question is still open. And somewhere between science and philosophy, between faith and doubt, between what humanity knows and what humanity can only wonder about, the search continues. Maybe the universe has an ultimate creator. Maybe reality is fundamentally different from anything we currently understand. Maybe consciousness holds secrets we have not yet discovered. Or maybe the universe has no supernatural foundation at all. Right now, humanity does not possess a universally accepted scientific demonstration that settles the question either way. And until that changes, the conversation remains open. Not because nobody has thought about it, but because perhaps the question itself is bigger than any single human being, any single religion, any single philosopher, and yes, even any artificial intelligence. And maybe that's why people keep asking. Because sometimes the questions that have no easy answers are the questions that reveal the most about who we really are.